Welcome to part 4 of Finding DnD, this one titled Essentially. Essentialism is a difficult form of worship to analyze. For one thing, it's more of a philosophy or an underlying point of view than it is anything claimed by those who are doing it, not in at least those words. So, to a great extent, I'll have to ask the viewer to decide when and how it applies in a particular case. I'll give you some examples, and even those aren't really laid down in stone by me so much as my perceptions of where essentialism may be found. It also has a longer history, both in the history of religion and also in terms of Dungeons and Dragons. It has a longer and more tenuous history of development than an appearance or a couple of very easily identifiable steps. Well, to take it to the history of religion, specifically 19th century Christianity in the United States, which is a particularly good laboratory for a lot of what I've been talking about. You find in the sphere of reform activism, relative to abolition, temperance, and a variety of other issues, you will find as well a recasting of personal religion and organizational religion, or organizations that begin to spring up around this recasting and very much embedded in that same reform. And the idea here is pretty clear. The idea here is to reject standing institutions of power and instead to say too that a given text, often used as kind of a weapon or a badge of office for these institutions, that the given text really isn't all that important chapter and verse, that instead there is a spirit or a theme, a discernible set of content which you can simply look at by reading and say, oh, okay, well, this is what it's talking about, and you don't really have to worry about whether the if or the and or the but. Also, you find things in those texts which are not really what's being purported or claims to be there by the institutions of power. Well, this is all very vague. Let me get specific. The specific case regards Jesus. So here you are, and you are an upper middle class reformist, and you are looking at the Bible and specifically looking through the New Testament bit by bit by bit, and you say, oh goodness, this is a whole bunch of different things and all these points of view are different, and wait, this is supposed to be Jesus, so let's take a look at the Jesus parts. And you look at that by themselves and you see a narrative and characterizations and various quotes and things that aren't really very much like the Jesus of the church or the Jesus of the state church in the case of the Anglican church. And you find instead, well, arguably, something of a bit of a wild-eyed hippie. Or anyway, you might not even go that far, but you might say, look, this is somebody who has these other values, and you can look and see various values that you like. You can see things like defying religious institutions. You can see things like questioning laws of behavior and comportment and status and money and institutionalized religions that you find appealing. And there's a tendency to say, well, look, this then is where the real thread of all this lies, and the other stuff is crusting it up. It's been added, and it's been kind of layered, and it's been sort of stuck together, and it's been, more importantly, co-opted by people of power. It's been co-opted historically, maybe incrementally, maybe unintentionally, in some cases definitely neither incrementally nor unintentionally. And it's time, forget it. We want to be really religious here. We want to be really honest. We want to be sincere. We want to be authentic. We are looking at what this was all about before all these grubbier interests got their hands on it. And instead of looking for a perfect text and saying, that's the text, and that's my text, and I believe in it, you see, it's the opposite of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism fastens upon a particular text and says what they know is in the text, and they feel it. It's very driven by the heart. They feel it. They got it. That's the text. And even if they quote the text, it doesn't mean anything except what they feel is in it. But they will hold that text like with all digits clenched. This is sort of the opposite. This is saying, well, loosen up about the text. Loosen up about the text and let's look at what, the part is in there that's clearly the important part and bring it into the modern world and be that for here now. And in many ways, it's got an intellectual quality rather than a passionate one. And it also is subject, as you're sure to have noticed, to projection. Strangely enough, the Jesus you find when you do that has a tendency to look a lot like you. And you say, oh, who knew? Well, in this case, in American history, we are talking specifically about Unitarianism, which is an older sect from Germany centuries before, but as recast in the 19th century in New England. And there's also a branch or a type that is called universalism, in which the idea here is, well, we can expand this idea out to not just various different parts and pieces of this particular Bible, but we can look across religions. It's much more of a kind of a multicultural look at all these different religions, and you're saying now, oh my goodness, there is a common thread. These things are really all about the same stuff. They have the same things in them, and they advise the same things from slightly different perspectives and with different examples and different personages and stuff. And whether you've got 1 or 3 or 19 or 502 gods, whatever. But look, the thing is there. And I will claim that universalism in the American tradition is not genuinely all things equal multicultural, but instead is always looking for the Jesus. There you are. Hinduism, oh my goodness, you see that guy Vishnu? See, Jesus. Oh, look, wow, what the Buddha said. Yeah, the Buddha, man, he's got some Jesus stuff going on there. Maybe Jesus learned from the Buddha, and maybe on the other hand you have stuff like, wow, remember I'm from California. Yeah, Jesus, man, there's a lot of Zen in what that cat says. So all this kind of possibly syncretic, but definitely Jesus focused. It legitimizes, from this point of view, it legitimizes some other religion if you find Jesus in it. These two named institutions, as they came to be, Unitarianism and Universalism in the United States, aren't really specifically my point. They are two of the more established and more organized and generally more geographically widespread of a much more diverse and a much, much more complicated carpet of applications of these same ideas. Specifically into the 1880s, you're going to find a lot of crisscross and common ground with even evangelical churches. You'll find a lot of different reform parsing. You'll find people who are all about saving the this or fixing the that, but not into the other thing, and then they argue with a group that's kind of the opposite, but they both consider themselves or they both characterized by this sort of religious language. The overlap with secular, straightforward, early anarchism and various branches of socialism and stuff like that, those are all there as well. And then as now, the edges between all of these things are exceptionally blurry. As soon as you get to the individual level, you're going to find somebody who says they're secular, but a faithful member of this church, and somebody who says that they're religious, but they're not part of that church, they just agree with it philosophically. Anyway, it gets really complicated at that level and isn't really all that important. Well, we were talking about role-playing. Keeping in mind that I am not using religion as an analogy, I'm talking about Dungeons and Dragons as a folk religion. So therefore, how does this apply? The first thing to understand is I guess, what you call the opposite of a long tail, a slow burn, an ongoing set of things that perhaps would contribute to the later development of these explicit approaches. And I guess it is fair to say that I'm talking about publications as potential acts of worship. But right now I'm talking about publications that I wouldn't make that claim for, but which might be seen as contributing to the slow burn of the production of such things later. And one of the first tendencies is the identification of Dungeons and Dragons content, especially in the 1970s, with A, the activity of role-playing, and then B, in the 80s, with the concept of fantasy as such. So of the former part, we can look clearly at something like Tunnels and Trolls, in which it began actually as Ken St. Andre simply taking the idea of fantasy role-playing as expressed in very earliest Dungeons and Dragons, making up his entire rule set by scratch and happily playing that. As a slight contrast with early Glorantha, in which a particular sort of D&D town was created as a piece, a tiny little piece and corner of Glorantha. This would be the big Revel and Pavis outside the walls. And you have this area in which it's fictionally set up to make sense that people would come from all over and that they would be in debt or penurious or ambitious or a little nuts, and that they would delve into these scary places with lots of monsters and lots of forgotten treasures and money and things like that. Then come back out to kind of this barter town outside where they can, pay off their debts and they can buy new stuff, and it's all kind of this big melange of setting stuff there. But the rest of the setting is built much more and is conceived much more of a cultural, political, philosophical ferment of dramatic potential, and less so this sort of, classic crawl activity as a really good precursor for what is to come. Again, as I keep saying, not as an act of worship, but Empire of the Petal Throne as indeed a powerfully developed fantasy with a creative and group creative history of its own, which, in order to be a role-playing game, must be cast in the form of the activities of Dungeons and Dragons. That fit has been odd from the beginning and continues to be. Whether it is a productive mismatch that people have turned into a strength of its own, or whether it continues to make that setting a little less coherent in this ordinary sense of the word, hard to get into because, wait, we're here doing this, but it's about that, is a matter of individual judgment. Examples like the Arduin Grimoire and in the game Dragon Quest and a few others can also be brought up. But again, I'm not really talking of these as acts of worship, simply the acceptance that this kind of activity, the crawl and the treasure hunt and the, kill your way through or out, it was the name of the game, and anybody who was publishing in it was going to be providing it in whole or in part, and that's an understandable thing. What happens as the years go by? You see some uneasy interactions between this particular kind of in-fiction activity and the fantasy. You can see some uncertainty about that, or some mismatches, or, if you will, some very clever compromises, or simply acceptance that this is what it is. I'm talking about games like Middle-earth role-playing, I'm talking about games like Rollmaster, games like Harn, games like Eastgarth, all kinds of interesting and often very committed senses of fantasy role-playing. You'll definitely see this in a slightly different form that I want to call attention to in terms of GURPS. Published in 1986 and extremely well articulated as, never mind all the established assumptions, you can play anything. You can be limited only by your imagination. You can be this creative and genre-driven and informed participant in the hobby in terms of what you create, and we've got a system to do it. Oh, and by the way, how do we prove it? Our very first pack that comes out, you guessed it, not only is it GURPS Fantasy, it's D&D Fantasy. In other words, we've got it all. It's like the first step of universalism here. We've got it all. It can do it all. It's all the same from place to place. Anyway, and because we know the system, the underlying thing that can do it all, and it's okay because you can do Jesus with it. So it's got this acknowledgement of the perception, the point of view, the acceptance of these phenomena well in hand. You'll also see it in some other games with very powerful and I think heartfelt senses of genre and also of aesthetics specific to that game and literary underpinnings that still, in the late 80s, it seems like an odd time to really have to do this, but it's important apparently. You have to have some kind of itinerant, beweapons, venturer out there looking for something valuable and dodging and confronting various meanies that are scattered about relative to those reward. I'm talking about Skyrealms of Jaroon, I'm talking about Talislanta, and a number of others in which the majority of the fictional content, including the identities and purposes of the characters, don't really seem to need any such justification or any need to do that kind of activity in the first place. They have other things to do, but there they are. Moving into later periods, there's more of a masterful adoption, co-option, even seizure of that kind of content, saying, well, we're not just kind of having it in here because we have to, but we are going to seize it, command it, own it, and do it our way entirely. Here I'm talking about Warhammer, I'm talking about Earth Dawn, and this general relationship to FASA and other companies that have a strong grasp of the contemporary hobby market and distribution. I know I've talked a great deal about the Heartbreakers in all the videos so far, and they do apply here in some ways, especially because here's where I think genuine acts of worship begin to apply. I'm not talking about the ones which are somewhat inadvertent in their use of D&D fantasy features. I'm talking about the ones that express them very much in an owned and re-articulated and often original way. And the best examples would probably be Legendary Lives, Homabrea, and in a different way, Forge Out of Chaos. So these games may be seen as acts of awareness that there is an underlying thing in the text, but you know what, that text in and of itself isn't the point. The point is, what is the thing? And when I say the thing in terms of my life, my experiences, my way, here's what it looks like. And so I think that's probably where you can start to see the first glimmerings of this principle in a religious sense toward Dungeons and Dragons. Which actually reminds me of something that I forgot to mention, which may be the example. Did I say it was the Heartbreakers that really kicks this off as acts of worship? What was I thinking? Legendary Adventures. Dangerous Journeys. What better example could one find of saying this is the essence of what is done according to names like Dungeons and Dragons and TSR, but they don't have the essence. The essence is here. And if you understand the essence, then you will see that the systemic processes which are provided here are front and center and unburdened by those crusty and irrelevant and historically accidental things that have shaped those texts and institutions. Which brings me to a very unsurprising point, that games written and published in this essentialist outlook tend to be excellent. They come straight out of real play. They come directly from valuing that experience of play, instead of saying, well, that was our experience and it was great, but how are other gamers going to get it? No, you say, that was that, and I will show how we do that. I'll refine those through more play. I will play and design in this sense that we are doing this thing successfully. And if it is different from some other text, well, that's part of the point anyway, because we're doing the it and bringing it forth in design and communication about it. A pedagogy of how to do it ranks, I think, near the top of role-playing texts throughout the hobby's history. Now, since then, quite a bit has happened, and the development of remarkable parallelisms to historical Unitarianism and universalism start to appear. Phrases like, it's insane to follow the rules as written, that it is playing old school DnD with a somewhat massaged version of 3.0, 3.5-ish, and the notion that you have a spirit there which a person should be able to discern, and that if you play with that spirit, it doesn't matter which rules you're using. It's okay. This counts. That's what matters. Again, it tends not to label itself as such, and it's a matter of raising this as a question rather than going through with my little kind of, ear tags and punching people in their ears and putting the tags on different ones. You'll find this scattered through any number of other somewhat personality-driven or internet, social, opinion-making kind of endeavors where you have a viewpoint which says, quite bluntly, never mind the additions, but not any one addition is actually quite there, but the thing that it is referring to can be there, can be seen, especially if you look down the history of it. You will see the shining path of what this thing really is, and you'll find it in places in the text where if you read it and you say, wow, there it is. Now again, pretty easy to say I'm looking at it and I'm seeing the essence of it, and in fact tend to be holding up a mirror and combing your hair. One finds, instead of particular texts, additions, justifications, well, this is the one I started with, so there. Things, not that kind of justification so much as phrases of principle and practice. Sandbox is one for sure. Particularly because it's not a very good term. And there are others as well. There's much, then they vary immensely. There's much talk of party cooperation, much talk of then other things that are hard to associate just with Dungeons and Dragons, like sense of wonder and stuff like that. Here the parallelism with real life religious history is exact, because you see, you're not being mean. You're not telling anybody that they're wrong or bad for clutching their one addition fiercely. You're not telling anybody that, they're bad, wrong, fun. You would never do any such thing. Because you see, you've seen this essence, and as long as anybody sees it too, that's okay. And if they don't, that's okay. People can be confused. People can be immature. People can be undeveloped. People can be, a little, they'll get it. Their hearts are in the right place. If they think, that's the argument. You see, you're not appealing to their hearts and their feelings. You're appealing to their thoughts. You're saying, well, when you think about it, you'll see. And until you get there, I like you anyway. I tolerate you. We are tolerant. This is the historical beef that many other groups, even other reform groups, have with the historical Unitarian and Universalist political tradition, is an admitted tendency to smugness. Sense of, well, yes, and we're religious, but we don't do anything so silly and superstitious as to, believe. Oh, we are very, very political, but we are not just political. We are not just self-interested. This is a church. And it can turn into a bit of a tap dance and can, frankly, get up the nose. I'm struggling with it a little bit because of all the different religious groups, traditions, and history that I'm referencing in these videos. This is the only one that really bugs me. And that same feature is represented in full among a number of the personage and principle and practice-based notions of, well, we play D&D because we see the essence, which is scooting through the editions, and not because following the rules of any one is supposed to be a good thing. Peasants do that. Superstitious people do that. Bad churches exploit that idea that, you follow the rules. And no, we don't do that. We see what it's about. So much for me not offending people, because that time I couldn't help it. Let's take a look now at publications which are striking acts of essentialist worship. And they are notable because they do not capture or try to capture the totality of the inspirational texts. In fact, they're saying, no, those inspirational texts are not really the point. We are taking a feature of the practice or some set of features of the practice and saying that's the essence, and we are going to bring that forth, and we are going to have our system which is built to do that very thing. Torchbearer, tremendously well named. How many torches you have left is very, very important in this game. How hungry, cold, and exhausted and injured is your character going to be in terms of playing your character? How much is their commitment to who they are and their own values going to undergo change? How will it advantage them? How will it disadvantage them? What will happen through the course of multiple instances of delving and danger, and who will be lost and who will be remembered, and all manner of things like that? It is the travails, the camping trip, the dark and cold. How dark is it here? Are my feet wet? All of these things are involved in Torchbearer in striking precision. Not just lists of stuff to remember, but a system which actually focuses that experience into a playable cycle. And looking at 13th Age, what do I see but something which is powerfully reminiscent of Dangerous Journeys? The same spirit of expertise, the same spirit of simplicity, the same spirit of nuance, and all the different corners of the simplicity, and a very strong sense of this is your starting character and this is how your character grows in a way which is not going to get undercut by some errant die roll. It's not going to get undercut by all kinds of crazy things that you could not have handled, ahead of time or conceived of ahead of time. Much more of a sense of love for this character is your creation, this character will grow, this character will become great. Then we can kind of shift and look at what I suppose could be called in some ways the spiritual, non-identical twin of 13th Age, which is Numenera. And here you have, instead of kind of the Unitarian approach, you have more of the universal approach, where you say, you see, if you do it in the far future, and you do it in this situation in which future tech is basically magic, and you have the same kind of social breakdowns and things that remind us of historical fantasy, and this is a very well-developed subset of science fiction and fantasy, you can do it. And it's the it. here. It's here too. You can find it here. And unlike Skyrealms of Jarun and similar, in which it's very much an odd little warty corner stuck off in the, in the panoply of the genuinely interesting setting and society and stuff like that. Instead, it's this weird little institution that people like enter into and do so that you can do the thing as a small piece of all this. Instead, it is front and center that this is what we are here to do. The political interactions of fundamentalism as religion and as effort, organized social effort in the history of the United States, particularly before it got that name, as I described in the previous video, the interactions between it and the organized political effort of essentialist practice, or which includes essentialist practice, is really complicated. There are lots and lots of areas of overlap. You can find the logic of one with the name of the other. And this happens in role-playing as well, particularly since the term OSR became big box and it became a little completely wide open as to who was going to claim it and for what. Even though you're saying, you don't give a shit about, this particular old text or that particular old text or anything like that. Well, that happens. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not making a big deal over exactly who is who and what is what. Perhaps it's not possible in some cases that the bleed is very strong, even though the two basic principles are very different. Here, the text and the heart. Here, any no text and the brain. The tendency for groups with these different philosophical or religious underpinnings to work together is both very strong and also just as often thrown apart due to mismatches of outlook. And I just leave these questions and ideas up to the viewer to apply to the environment we stand in with role-playing and Dungeons and Dragons as you see fit. I have set up enough now, I think, to say it's time for the conclusion coming in part 5.